Joining us right now to talk about that is Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg. Secretary Buttigieg, thank you for being here today. It's good to see you.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me on.
Let's talk a little bit about whether there's likely to be any bipartisanship when it comes to this. The president himself has said that he would like to find out, at least decide if there's a bipartisanship, has given it a deadline of maybe Memorial Day. So where do you think things stand at this point?
Well, we continue to be hopeful about the bipartisan approach. We've had lots of conversations across the aisle. We've been talking with people in both chambers and put forward a counter proposal on Friday that reduced our original position by about $500 billion, moving closer to where the Republican counteroffer had been. That's with them now. We'll see what they come back with. Obviously, a process like this will have a lot of ups and downs, twists and turns, but what we don't have a lot of is time. We really need to make progress here because, as the president often says, inaction is not an option. Every few days, it seems, we get another headline about some piece of critical infrastructure in this country not doing what it's supposed to do, a reminder of just how urgent it is for us to get back on track and go beyond what we've had in the past if we want the U.S. to actually win the future.
Your plan has come down by about $500 billion, as you said, but it's still about $1 trillion more than the Republicans are offering in their counter plan. So there's still a huge gap when it comes to the funding. Also a huge gap, I think, when it comes to the areas that they'd be willing to address. The Republicans have said that they'd be willing to address something when it comes to traditional sense of infrastructure, bridges, roads, things like those types of things, even broadband. But what the administration is kind of asking for is a much bigger picture. You're talking about issues like remediation of brownfields, like caregiving when it comes to the aging and disabled, construction and modernization of the veterans hospitals. And these are areas that the Republicans said they just don't consider them to be infrastructure. They're not willing to do this in one bill. Are you going to get to the point where you say forget it and you move on? And if that's the case, you'd have to have all those votes there in the Democratic Party. Do you have that at this point?
Well, we'd really prefer to do this together, but again, inaction is not an option. I hope we don't get too wrapped around the axle around these definitional questions. Look, we think all of these things ought to be part of an infrastructure package, but you don't have to agree with us on that to agree on a good policy. I imagine if I were a Democratic senator and a Republican president came along and said, we're going to remove every lead pipe in the country, but this White House considers that part of food policy, so we're putting it in the agriculture bill. I might think that's a strange categorization, but I'd still vote for it because it's the right thing to do. We can agree to disagree on some of the terminology, the categories, but if it's a good policy, let's come together and get it done.
I think the Republicans would probably question whether they think some of these things are good policies. Maybe not when it comes to lead pipes. That might be something that you could get agreement on. But when you're talking about the expansion of the electric vehicle structure, when you're talking about remediation of brownfields and other environmental sites, they may want to look at that as a separate thing and say, I can absolutely agree with this, but not with that. Let's put that aside, though. Let's just get to the point where whether you have the votes within the Democratic Party, because you need just about every single vote in order to get this passed. Can you do this through reconciliation at this point?
Well, again, our strongly preferred approach is to do it on a bipartisan basis, but there's tons of support for this, not just among Democratic elected officials, but among Democratic and Republican Americans who are looking at us, I think, with a real sense of impatience. You know, when the jobs plan was unveiled, it had enormous support and continues to among the American people. It's an example of one of these moments where sometimes Washington doesn't reflect the way the American people feel, but I think it can move in that direction. And that's exactly what we're going to be focused on as these talks continue over the coming days. We have come closer in terms of what we put forward. There's definitely still distance. We started very far apart. But what I know is that I hear legislators, Republicans and Democrats, every day talking about their shared sense of urgency to do something, not just with roads and bridges, but things like pipes and internet and a lot more. This is the moment where we're going to decide whether America's serious about winning the future or whether we're content to not even be in the top 10. And we can't do all of this, go through all of this trouble just to hold on to 13th place. This is a crossroads where America is deciding whether we in fact want to lead in the 21st century. If we do, we literally need to put our money where our mouth is.
I think a lot of these programs are popular when you poll voters, when you ask them how to pay for it, maybe a little less popular. But I'll go back to the issue of, do you have the votes in the Democratic Party right now to do this through reconciliation?
Again, that's a theoretical exercise when we haven't even turned to that mechanism. Right now, we not only have a lot of Democrats who are excited about this, we got a lot of Republicans who are excited about this. And it's obviously working toward a final form. And there are negotiations going on within the House and the Senate. Over the weekend, a bipartisan plan that's part of the foundational baseline bill on the highways and surface slice was announced with bipartisan support. So progress is happening. There's a lot of give and take right now. That's natural. But what we can't do is sit still. I do want to mention, though, that when you ask the American people about our proposal on how to pay for this, support for the plan actually goes up. It's actually more popular when we talk about how we propose to pay for it, because most Americans agree with the president that ordinary Americans are paying plenty in taxes, but a lot of corporations are not paying their fair share.
Yeah, it's usually pretty popular when you ask people how to pay for it, and as long as it doesn't include them, they're okay with it. Look, the Republicans have come back to this idea that used to be a pretty bipartisan issue, and that was to have things like a user fee. The gas tax is something that we've seen over the years that has not gone up, has not increased, and as you have more and more people using electric vehicles, more people get away without paying some of those fees. Would you ever consider the idea of a user fee, a gas tax, or a user fee for electric vehicles to help out, at least in some way, to pay for some of this actual infrastructure?
You know, that's not in our plan. And the reason is that there's a simple and very important principle for the president here, which is that no one making less than $400,000 should have their taxes increased by this plan. Again, he believes most Americans, ordinary Americans, are paying enough, more than enough, right now. But the other thing I think is really important to point out is you don't have to. You don't have to in order to fully fund this bill. Remember, we have gone so far in the direction of giveaways to corporations and the wealthy that we've now reached the point where you could reset the tax rate to a level that's still lower than it's been in most of my lifetime, close the loopholes that create incentives to park profits and even jobs overseas, and have more than enough to fully pay for this bill. Now, if they're prepared to come together with other ideas, we're interested in that. And actually one area that could be an interesting slice of this is how we mobilize private dollars to be part of the solution. That's not going to be enough on its own, but certainly being creative about financing is a smart thing to do in the 21st century to really put as many resources as we can to work improving the infrastructure of this country. We can't just tinker around the edges, and we definitely can't do what we've always done, because then we're going to get what we've always got, and it's just not good enough.
You know, there was some progress put forth. Janet Yellen, the Secretary of Treasury, has talked about how it's very important from her perspective to get a global minimum tax for corporations. And it certainly looks like there's progress towards moving towards a 15% global minimum tax. If that's the case, though, you have to wonder what our country is going to do in terms of what they charge multinationals. Would that limit be brought down to maybe 21% so that there's less of a gap with the global tax so that American companies are at less of a disadvantage?
Well, again, a lot of complications in terms of how a minimum tax would interact with a sticker rate here in the U.S. But let's be clear that with no global minimum tax and tax rates that sometimes were north of 30 or even 40% in the U.S., American business was very competitive. The president's plan calls for 28%, a level that is lower than it has been for most of our lifetime. But let's look at other ideas that we're eager to hear. We just need to make sure they're specific enough to get the job done, and that they keep fidelity with the president's promise that he intends to keep, not to raise taxes on most Americans.
Would you say that Memorial Day is going to be the deadline? Are we sticking with that deadline to see if there's bipartisanship, or do you think it could stretch beyond that?
You know, we continue to think it's really important to have major progress by Memorial Day. And of course, that's coming on up. That means there's a lot of pressure on the work we're doing this week and in these next few days to get something done. Obviously, that doesn't mean that a bill will be passed through both houses, reconciled, brought to the president's desk, and signed. But it does mean that we really need some forward motion here, because we can't just string this along. I think the American people will lose patience with us, and I don't think the president has patience for things to go in circles. But what I'll say is that so far, we've had very honest, above board, good faith, and meaningful conversations about where Republican senators started, where we started, and how we can get closer together. Reducing our package by $500 billion is, I think, a very meaningful move in that direction. And we're eager to see how they respond with a counter.
Secretary Buttigieg, I want to thank you for your time today. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.